Foundations and Developments in African Philosophy. Module 1. The Question of African Philosophy. Is there philosophy in Africa? For centuries, a fundamental question has shaped discussions about African thought. Is there philosophy in Africa? Some scholars have denied the existence of African philosophy, arguing that philosophy as a formal discipline is uniquely Western. Others assert that Africa has its own intellectual traditions deeply rooted in oral literature, proverbs, myths, and structured ways of thinking. But before we engage in this debate, we must first ask, what is philosophy? Philosophy, at its core, is the pursuit of wisdom. It involves critical thinking, questioning, and the analysis of fundamental aspects of life, knowledge, existence, morality, and reality. The word itself originates from the Greek terms philo, meaning love, and sophia, meaning wisdom. Philosophy, therefore, is the love of wisdom. Throughout history, philosophers have explored metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, logic, and aesthetics. The key question is this: does Africa have traditions of deep thinking that engage with these philosophical domains? If so, why has African philosophy been questioned? The denial of African philosophy. For a long time, many Western scholars denied the existence of African philosophy. During the colonial era, European thinkers viewed Africa as a land without intellectual depth, reasoning, or systematic thought. One of the most influential voices in this perspective was G.W.F. Hegel, who claimed that Africa had no history and, therefore, no philosophy. Similarly, Lucien Levy-Bruhl argued that African thought was pre-logical, meaning it was based on mystical beliefs and communal traditions rather than reasoned argumentation. This perspective was rooted in a Eurocentric bias, assuming that philosophy must be written, formalized, and structured in the way that Greek, European, or modern Western philosophy is. Since much of African thought was transmitted orally, it was dismissed as folklore rather than true philosophy. However, if we apply this logic consistently, we must also reject the philosophy of Socrates, who wrote nothing himself. His ideas were preserved through oral transmission by his student, Plato. If oral tradition does not disqualify Socrates from being a philosopher, why should it disqualify African thought? Ethnophilosophy versus professional philosophy. As African scholars began to challenge the denial of African philosophy, a debate emerged within African intellectual circles. This debate led to the formation of two major schools of thought: ethnophilosophy and professional philosophy. Ethnophilosophy argues that African philosophy is embedded in communal traditions, proverbs, folk wisdom, myths, and the worldview of African societies. According to this perspective, African philosophy does not necessarily have to take the form of written texts or systematic arguments. Instead, it exists within oral traditions, social practices, and indigenous knowledge systems. One of the most prominent advocates of ethnophilosophy was Placide Tempels, a Belgian missionary who studied the beliefs of the Bantu people. In his book Bantu Philosophy, 1945, Tempels argued that African thought was structured around the concept of vital force, which shaped their understanding of reality, being, and morality. Later, African scholars such as Leopold Senger expanded on ethnophilosophy by emphasizing the intuitive and communal nature of African thought. Critics of ethnophilosophy, however, argue that it treats African philosophy as a collective, anonymous tradition rather than as a discipline shaped by individual thinkers. They point out that Western philosophy values individual contributions, Plato, Descartes, Kant, whereas ethnophilosophy tends to generalize African thought as something shared by an entire culture. This critique gave rise to the professional philosophy movement. Professional philosophy insists that African philosophy must meet the same standards as philosophy in other traditions. According to this view, true philosophy requires critical analysis, debate, and the development of independent ideas by individual African philosophers. Paulin Hountondji, a strong critic of ethnophilosophy, argued that treating African philosophy as mere folk wisdom prevented Africans from engaging in true philosophical inquiry. Instead, he called for a professionalized African philosophy that involved rigorous argumentation and individual contributions to philosophical discourse. Other professional philosophers, such as Kwasi Wiredu, worked to reconstruct African thought using analytical tools from contemporary philosophy. Wiredu explored concepts such as truth, logic, and ethics from an African perspective while engaging with Western philosophical traditions. This approach sought to integrate African philosophy into global philosophical discourse rather than treating it as something separate or inferior. Oral tradition as a philosophical system. A key argument in favor of ethnophilosophy is that African philosophy has always existed, even if it was not written down in the way that European philosophy was. Many African societies have rich traditions of structured debates, councils of elders, and ethical deliberations. Proverbs serve as condensed forms of philosophical wisdom. For example, the Akan proverb, "Wisdom is like a baobab tree. No one individual can embrace it all," conveys an epistemological principle: knowledge is vast, and no single person can possess all truth. Similarly, many African communities practiced palaver, a method of collective decision-making that involved extensive dialogue, reasoning, and consensus building. This is not unlike Socratic dialogue, where knowledge emerges through conversation. These traditions demonstrate that African societies have engaged in systematic thinking and ethical reflection for centuries. The concept of Ubuntu is another powerful example. Ubuntu, often translated as "I am because we are," is a moral and metaphysical framework emphasizing interdependence, community, and human dignity. It offers a unique ethical perspective that contrasts with Western individualism, showing that African thought has its own contributions to moral philosophy. The middle ground, reconciling ethnophilosophy and professional philosophy. Today, many scholars argue that ethnophilosophy and professional philosophy are not mutually exclusive but complementary. Ethnophilosophy provides the foundation, preserving the deep wisdom of African traditions, while professional philosophy builds upon this foundation, engaging in critical analysis and systematic argumentation. This integrated approach recognizes that African philosophy is both communal and individual, oral and written, traditional and modern. African philosophers can draw from their cultural heritage while also contributing to contemporary philosophical debates. Conclusion. So, is there philosophy in Africa? The answer is a resounding yes. The idea that philosophy only exists in written form is a narrow and Eurocentric definition. African societies have long engaged in deep intellectual inquiry, whether through oral traditions, structured debates, or individual philosophical works. The debate between ethnophilosophy and professional philosophy highlights the richness and diversity of African thought. While ethnophilosophy captures the collective wisdom of African traditions, professional philosophy pushes for rigorous academic engagement. Together, they form a holistic understanding of African philosophy, one that honors the past while shaping the future. In our next lesson, we will dive deeper into the question, what is African philosophy? Stay tuned as we continue our exploration of the great thinkers, ideas, and traditions that define African intellectual history. If you found this discussion thought-provoking, let us know in the comments. Do you think oral traditions can be considered philosophy? Should African philosophy follow Western academic standards, or should it maintain its unique approach? Let's continue the conversation.